November 27, 1950. 2,200 hours. Yudam-ni, North Korea. Lieutenant Colonel Raymond Davis heard the bugles first. Chinese bugles, dozens of them, echoing to the frozen mountains surrounding the village of Yudam-ni. The temperature was 40 degrees below zero, -40 on both Fahrenheit and Celsius scales. So cold that weapons froze solid. So cold that exposed skin froze in seconds. So cold that men who'd been fighting in the Pacific Islands during World War II couldn't believe human beings could survive in these conditions. Then came the screaming. Thousands of voices, tens of thousands, Chinese soldiers charging down from the mountains in human wave attacks. Davis could see muzzle flashes everywhere. Not just in front of his position, but behind it, to the left, to the right, surrounding the Marine positions completely. And he realized with absolute clarity that the 8,000 Marines at Yudam-ni weren't advancing toward the Yalu River anymore. They were surrounded by at least 60,000 Chinese soldiers who'd been hiding in the mountains waiting for this moment. The Marines were trapped at the bottom of a frozen valley at the Chosin Reservoir, 78 miles from the nearest port and safety. The single dirt road connecting them to the coast, the main supply route, or MSR, ran through mountain passes that were now occupied by Chinese forces. The temperature was 40 below zero and dropping. Behind them was China and certain death. Ahead was 78 miles of frozen hell through mountains crawling with enemy soldiers who outnumbered them 4-1, and the thermometer was still dropping. This is the story of the Battle of Chosin Reservoir, known to those who fought there as the Frozen Chosin. 17 days of continuous combat in the coldest conditions American forces have ever fought in, a battle where frostbite caused more casualties than bullets, where weapons had to be thawed with urine before they would fire, where wounded men froze to death before medics could treat them, and where Marines surrounded by overwhelming enemy forces in impossible conditions refused to surrender and instead fought their way 78 miles through Chinese lines to reach safety. It's the story of 30,000 Marines who were told they were trapped and responded, "We're not retreating. We're attacking in a different direction." It's the story of men who carried every wounded Marine 78 miles rather than leave anyone behind. And it's the story of how the 1st Marine Division, surrounded and outnumbered, destroyed the Chinese 9th Army Group and turned what should have been a catastrophic defeat into a legendary victory. The Korean War began on June 25, 1950, when North Korean forces crossed the 38th parallel and invaded South Korea. The invasion was a surprise, and South Korean forces, backed by a small number of American military advisors, were quickly overwhelmed. Within weeks, North Korean forces had captured most of the Korean peninsula, pushing South Korean and American forces into a small defensive perimeter around the port city of Pusan in the southeast corner of Korea. The United Nations Security Council, with the Soviet Union absent and unable to veto, authorized military intervention to defend South Korea. President Harry Truman committed American forces to the conflict, and General Douglas MacArthur, who commanded U.S. forces in the Pacific from his headquarters in Tokyo, was put in charge of UN forces in Korea. MacArthur planned a bold counteroffensive. On September 15, 1950, he launched an amphibious assault at Incheon, a port city on Korea's west coast near Seoul. The Incheon landing was a brilliant success, cutting North Korean supply lines and forcing North Korean forces to retreat. Within weeks, UN forces had recaptured Seoul and were pushing north, driving North Korean forces back across the 38th parallel toward the Chinese border. By November 1950, the war seemed nearly won. North Korean forces were shattered and retreating in disorder. MacArthur, confident of victory, told President Truman that American troops would be home by Christmas. UN forces pushed toward the Yalu River, which formed the border between North Korea and China. The plan was to occupy all of North Korea, eliminate the North Korean government, and reunify Korea under South Korean control. But there was a problem. China had warned repeatedly that if UN forces approached the Chinese border, China would intervene in the war. MacArthur dismissed these warnings as bluffs. He believed the Chinese wouldn't dare fight the United States, that they lacked the capability to intervene effectively, and that even if they did intervene, American air power and superior technology would quickly defeat them. MacArthur was catastrophically wrong. Starting in mid-October 1950, the Chinese began secretly moving massive forces across the Yalu River into North Korea. The Chinese 9th Army Group, approximately 150,000 soldiers organized into multiple divisions, infiltrated into the mountains of northeastern Korea without being detected by American intelligence. They moved at night, hid during the day, maintained radio silence, and used the mountainous terrain to conceal their movements. American reconnaissance aircraft flying overhead saw nothing. American intelligence officers analyzing enemy radio traffic heard nothing. As far as MacArthur and his staff knew, there were no significant Chinese forces in North Korea. The Chinese soldiers were tough, experienced troops, many of them veterans of the Chinese Civil War that had ended in 1949 with a communist victory. They were poorly equipped by American standards. Many carried bolt-action rifles rather than semi-automatic weapons. They lacked artillery and air support, and their logistics were primitive. But they were accustomed to hardship, capable of surviving on minimal rations, and willing to accept casualties that would be unacceptable to Western armies. And they had one enormous advantage. They knew exactly where the American and UN forces were, while the Americans had no idea the Chinese were even in Korea. The 1st Marine Division, commanded by Major General Oliver P. Smith, was assigned to X-Corps, which was operating on the eastern side of Korea separate from the main UN force, advancing up the western side of the peninsula. X-Corps' mission was to advance north toward the Yalu River, securing the eastern approaches to the border and preventing North Korean forces from escaping into China. General Smith was a cautious, methodical officer who'd served in the Pacific during World War II. He was skeptical of MacArthur's optimism and concerned about the rapid advance into increasingly difficult terrain as winter approached. The Marines were advancing along a single narrow dirt road, the main supply route, or MSR, that wound through mountains and passed through a series of small villages. If Chinese forces cut the MSR behind them, the Marines would be trapped with no way to resupply or evacuate wounded. Smith expressed these concerns to his superior officers, but was overruled. MacArthur wanted to reach the Yalu River as quickly as possible to end the war, before winter set in. X-Corps Commander, Major General Edward Almond, pushed the Marines to advance faster, dismissing Smith's concerns as excessive caution. By mid-November 1950, the 1st Marine Division was stretched out along 78 miles of mountain road from the port of Hungnam on the coast to the village of Yudam-ni near the Chosin Reservoir. The division was divided into several main concentrations. At Yudam-ni, the furthest north, approximately 8,000 Marines from the 5th and 7th Marine Regiments at Hagaru-ri, about 14 miles south, the division headquarters, and approximately 3,000 Marines and Army troops at Hagaru-ri, another 11 miles south, approximately 2,500 Marines at Hungnam, near the coast. Another Marine garrison scattered along the MSR between these positions, various smaller units, supply convoys, and support elements. The Marines were not concentrated as a single force. They were spread out over 78 miles of road, with Chinese-controlled mountains on both sides. If the Chinese attacked in force, the Marines would be isolated from each other, unable to support or reinforce one another, and the temperature was dropping. Korea's winters are brutally cold, with temperatures in the northern mountains regularly falling below 0 Fahrenheit. By mid-November, temperatures were dropping toward -20, -30, and colder. The Marines had been issued cold weather gear, parkas, insulated boots, gloves, but nothing could really prepare troops for fighting at -40 degrees. At -40 degrees Fahrenheit, which is also -40 Celsius, the point where both temperature scales converge, exposed human skin freezes in less than 5 minutes. Metal becomes so cold that touching it with bare skin causes instant frostbite. Weapon lubricants congeal and freeze, causing rifles and machine guns to jam. Vehicle engines won't start without extended warming. Batteries die. Radio equipment fails. Food freezes solid. Water freezes in canteens. Wounded men die from exposure before they can be evacuated, and combat becomes a nightmare. Soldiers can't feel their trigger fingers through heavy gloves. They can't operate bolt-action mechanisms with numb hands. They can't clear weapon jams when the metal is so cold it burns to touch. They can't treat wounded comrades when medical supplies are frozen solid. Fighting at -40 isn't just difficult. It approaches the limits of human endurance. On November 25th, advanced element of Marines at Yudam-ni encountered Chinese forces. Not North Koreans, but Chinese troops in different uniforms speaking a different language. The Marines reported this contact up the chain of command, but intelligence officers at X-Corps headquarters dismissed the reports. There couldn't be significant Chinese forces in the area. It must have been a small unit, perhaps advisors or volunteers, nothing to worry about. On November 26th, more contact with Chinese forces, more reports, more dismissals from higher headquarters. On November 27th, the Chinese 9th Army Group, approximately 120,000 soldiers, attacked simultaneously at multiple points along the entire 78-mile stretch of the main supply route. The trap had sprung. The Chinese attack began after dark on November 27, 1950, with coordinated assaults on every major marine position from Yudam-ni in the north to Hungnam in the south. The Chinese had positioned their forces in the mountains overlooking the marine positions, and they attacked downhill in massive human wave assaults designed to overwhelm defenders through sheer numbers and shock effect. At Yudam-ni, approximately 8,000 Marines were surrounded by an estimated 60,000 Chinese soldiers from multiple divisions of 9th Army Group. The Chinese attacked from 3 directions simultaneously, from the north, east, and west, attempting to cut off and destroy the Marine regiments before they could withdraw. The attack began with bugles. Chinese forces used bugles and whistles for communication and coordination, and the sound of hundreds of bugles echoing through the mountains was genuinely terrifying to soldiers who'd never heard it before. Then came the human wave attacks. Thousands of Chinese soldiers charging down from the mountains, screaming and blowing bugles, firing rifles and throwing grenades, wave after wave regardless of casualties. Lieutenant Colonel Raymond Davis, commanding the 1st Battalion, 7th Marines, found himself fighting on multiple sides simultaneously. Chinese forces had infiltrated around his positions and were attacking from directions that should have been secure rear areas. Marines who'd gone to sleep thinking they were in safe positions woke up to find Chinese soldiers inside their defensive perimeter. The temperature was minus 40 degrees. Marines trying to fire their M1 Garand rifles found that the weapons wouldn't function. The lubricating oil had frozen, causing the gas-operated action to jam. Soldiers had to work the bolt manually for each shot, reducing their rate of fire drastically. Machine guns froze solid and had to be thawed before they would fire. Some Marines discovered that urinating on frozen weapon mechanisms would generate enough heat to temporarily unfreeze them, a desperate and undignified solution that became common practice during the battle. Corpsmen, Navy medics assigned to Marine units, found that their medical supplies were useless. Morphine syrettes, small doses of morphine in sealed tubes, designed to be injected quickly to treat combat wounds, were frozen solid. Medics had to warm morphine syrettes against their skin or in their mouths before the morphine would flow, and by that time wounded Marines had often already died from shock or blood loss. Blood plasma for transfusions was frozen solid in its containers. Bandages were frozen stiff and had to be thawed before they could be applied to wounds. Wounded Marines faced a terrible equation. If they were left outside in minus 40-degree temperatures, they would freeze to death within an hour even if their wounds weren't immediately fatal. But there was no warm shelter large enough to hold all the wounded, and there weren't enough medical supplies to treat everyone properly even if shelter had been available. Corpsmen did their best, but men were dying from cold and shock as much as from combat wounds. Dead Marines froze solid within minutes of death. Bodies became rigid in whatever position they died, frozen hard as wood. Marines trying to move dead comrades to collection points found that frozen corpses were incredibly heavy and awkward to carry. They couldn't be bent or repositioned, couldn't be placed gently, had to be stacked like cordwood because there was no way to bury them in ground frozen solid to a depth of several feet. The Chinese suffered even more from the cold than the Marines. Chinese soldiers were equipped with thin quilted cotton uniforms that provided minimal insulation against minus 40-degree temperatures. Many Chinese soldiers had canvas shoes with rubber soles rather than insulated boots. They had no gloves, no cold weather gear, no sleeping bags rated for extreme cold. Chinese troops attacking the Marine positions were already suffering from frostbite and hypothermia before the fighting even started. American soldiers who examined Chinese casualties after battles found that many Chinese soldiers had died from cold rather than combat wounds. Bodies found with no visible injuries, frozen solid in crouching or crawling positions, had simply stopped moving when hypothermia shut down their bodies. Some Chinese soldiers were found frozen to death in attacking positions, their rifles unfired, having died from cold before they could engage the enemy. Puller's bravado wasn't just for show. He genuinely believed that being surrounded was an advantage because it meant the Chinese couldn't escape. The Marines would kill them no matter which direction the Marines moved. And Puller's confidence inspired the Marines under his command to believe they could win despite impossible odds. At Fox Company's position on a mountain pass between Yudam-ni and Hagaru-ri, Captain William Barber and 240 Marines were defending a critical position that controlled the main road. Fox Company had been placed on Taktong Pass, a strategic hilltop overlooking the MSR, with orders to hold a position and keep the road open for convoys. When the Chinese attacked on November 27th, Fox Company was assaulted by an estimated 10,000 Chinese soldiers from 2 divisions. The Chinese needed to control Taktong Pass to prevent the Marines at Yudam-ni from escaping south to Hagaru-ri. Fox Company was vastly outnumbered. 10,000 Chinese against 240 Marines, roughly 40-to-1 odds. The Chinese attacked in human waves throughout the night of November 27th to 28th. Marines fought hand-to-hand with Chinese soldiers who penetrated the perimeter. Captain Barber was wounded early in the battle, shot in the hip by Chinese fire, but refused evacuation and continued commanding his company while lying on the frozen ground wrapped in a sleeping bag because he couldn't stand. Fox Company held through 5 nights of continuous Chinese attacks, through temperatures dropping to minus 40 degrees and below, through mounting casualties and dwindling ammunition. Fox Company held Taktong Pass. By the end of the battle, Fox Company had suffered about 50% casualties, 26 killed, 89 wounded, but they had held their position and kept the road open. Captain Barber would receive the Medal of Honor for his leadership during the 5-day defense. By November 30th, 3 days into the battle, the situation of the 1st Marine Division was dire. The Marines were scattered along 78 miles of frozen mountain road, surrounded by Chinese forces that outnumbered them at least 4-to-1. Thousands of Marines were wounded and accumulating at Hagaru-ri faster than they could be evacuated by air. Ammunition and supplies were running low. The temperature was minus 40 degrees and showing no sign of warming. And the Chinese were attacking constantly, trying to overrun Marine positions before Marines could organize and escape. Higher headquarters, X-Corps and Far East Command, were discussing the possibility that the 1st Marine Division might be destroyed, that the Marines were surrounded and would be annihilated like Custer at Little Bighorn. Some officers suggested that the Marines should abandon their equipment and wounded, break out of the encirclement in small groups, and try to reach safety as individuals. General Oliver P. Smith, commanding the 1st Marine Division, rejected that suggestion absolutely. The Marines would break out as a division, with all wounded, with all equipment, in an organized fighting withdrawal. They would not abandon anyone. They would not leave equipment for the Chinese. And they would destroy any Chinese forces that tried to stop them. Smith's plan was audacious. The Marines would consolidate at Hagaru-ri, then fight their way south 78 miles through Chinese positions to reach the port of Hungnam and evacuate by sea. It would be a fighting withdrawal through mountains in minus 40-degree temperatures against an enemy that outnumbered them 4-to-1. It would require carrying 4,000 wounded Marines the entire distance, protecting supply convoys, and moving tanks and artillery through mountain passes on roads that could barely accommodate them. Military historians would later describe it as one of the most difficult military operations ever attempted. The Marines called it attacking in a different direction. The breakout began on December 1st, 1950. Puller's bravado wasn't just for show. He genuinely believed that being surrounded was an advantage because it meant the Chinese couldn't escape. The Marines would kill them no matter which direction the Marines moved. And Puller's confidence inspired the Marines under his command to believe they could win despite impossible odds. At Fox Company's position on a mountain pass between Yudam-ni and Hagaru-ri, Captain William Barber and 240 Marines were defending a critical position that controlled the main road. Fox Company had been placed on Taktong Pass, a strategic hilltop overlooking the MSR, with orders to hold a position and keep the road open for convoys. When the Chinese attacked on November 27th, Fox Company was assaulted by an estimated 10,000 Chinese soldiers from 2 divisions. The Chinese needed to control Taktong Pass to prevent the Marines at Yudam-ni from escaping south to Hagaru-ri. Fox Company was vastly outnumbered. 10,000 Chinese against 240 Marines, roughly 40-to-1 odds. The Chinese attacked in human waves throughout the night of November 27th to 28th. Marines fought hand-to-hand with Chinese soldiers who'd penetrated the perimeter. Captain Barber was wounded early in the battle, shot in the hip by Chinese fire, but refused evacuation and continued commanding his company while lying on the frozen ground wrapped in a sleeping bag because he couldn't stand. Fox Company held through 5 nights of continuous Chinese attacks, through temperatures dropping to minus 40 degrees and below, through mounting casualties and dwindling ammunition. Fox Company held Taktong Pass. By the end of the battle, Fox Company had suffered about 50% casualties, 26 killed, 89 wounded, but they had held their position and kept the road open. Captain Barber would receive the Medal of Honor for his leadership during the 5-day defense. By November 30th, 3 days into the battle, the situation of the 1st Marine Division was dire. The Marines were scattered along 78 miles of frozen mountain road, surrounded by Chinese forces that outnumbered them at least 4-to-1. Thousands of Marines were wounded and accumulating at Hagaru-ri faster than they could be evacuated by air. Ammunition and supplies were running low. The temperature was minus 40 degrees and showing no sign of warming. and the Chinese were attacking constantly, trying to overrun Marine positions before the Marines could organize and escape. Higher headquarters, X-Corps and Far East Command, were discussing the possibility that the 1st Marine Division might be destroyed, that the Marines were surrounded and would be annihilated like Custer at Little Bighorn. Some officers suggested that the Marines should abandon their equipment and wounded, break out of the encirclement in small groups, and try to reach safety as individuals. General Oliver P. Smith, commanding the 1st Marine Division, rejected that suggestion absolutely. The Marines would break out as a division, with all wounded, with all equipment, in an organized fighting withdrawal. They would not abandon anyone. They would not leave equipment for the Chinese, and they would destroy any Chinese forces that tried to stop them. Smith's plan was audacious. The Marines would consolidate at Hagaru-ri, then fight their way south 78 miles through Chinese positions to reach the port of Hungnam and evacuate by sea. It would be a fighting withdrawal through mountains and minus 40-degree temperatures against an enemy that outnumbered them 4-1. It would require carrying 4,000 wounded Marines the entire distance, protecting supply convoys, and moving tanks and artillery through mountain passes on roads that could barely accommodate them. Military historians would later describe it as one of the most difficult military operations ever attempted. The Marines called it attacking in a different direction. The breakout began on December 1st, 1950. The first phase of the breakout was extracting the 8,000 Marines at Yudam-ni and getting them to Hagaru-ri, 14 miles away. This required fighting through Chinese positions that controlled the road, rescuing Fox Company at Tokton Pass, and moving a massive column of trucks carrying wounded Marines and equipment through mountain passes in minus 40-degree weather while Chinese forces attacked from the surrounding heights. Lieutenant Colonel Raymond Davis was given one of the most difficult missions. Take a battalion of about 500 Marines, march overland to the mountains, bypass Chinese positions on the main road, and reach Fox Company at Tokton Pass to relieve them and open the road for the main column. Davis's march began on the night of November 30th. His Marines left the relative safety of Yudam-ni's defensive perimeter and began climbing into the mountains in darkness in minus 40-degree cold, carrying wounded comrades and all their weapons and ammunition. They had no vehicles. The terrain was too rough for trucks, so everything had to be carried by hand. The march was a nightmare. Marines climbed steep mountain slopes in darkness, slipping on ice, struggling through snow that was waist-deep in places. The cold was so intense that Marines had to be rotated frequently. 10 minutes of carrying a wounded man on a stretcher, then 10 minutes of rest, because their hands would freeze to the stretcher poles, and they couldn't let go until someone else relieved them. Chinese forces attacked Davis's column repeatedly during the march. His Marines had to stop, fight off the attacks, then resume the march. Men were falling from exhaustion and frostbite. Several Marines simply stopped moving, too cold and tired to continue, and had to be physically carried by their comrades. Davis's battalion reached Fox Company on December 2nd after marching approximately 8 miles to the mountains over difficult terrain and brutal cold while fighting off multiple Chinese attacks. They'd lost about 100 men, killed, wounded, or too frostbitten to continue, but they'd accomplished their mission. Fox Company was relieved, and the road to Hagaru-ri was open. For leading this operation, Lieutenant Colonel Raymond Davis would receive the Medal of Honor. The main column from Yudam-ni began moving south on December 1st. The column consisted of thousands of Marines, hundreds of vehicles carrying wounded and equipment, and all the division's organic artillery and armor, moving this massive formation 14 miles through Chinese-controlled territory in minus 40-degree, weather was going to take several days of continuous fighting. The Chinese attacked the column constantly. Every hill overlooking the road had Chinese soldiers firing down into the American vehicles. Every village along the route was occupied by Chinese forces who had to be cleared out in house-to-house fighting. Every bridge and culvert was potentially destroyed by Chinese engineers trying to block the road. Marines formed the column into a moving fortress. Infantry units marched on both sides of the road, providing security for the vehicle convoy. Tanks and artillery moved with the column, providing fire support. Marines on the flanks climbed into the mountains to clear Chinese positions before they could fire on the convoy. It was slow, exhausting work, made infinitely worse by the cold and the constant Chinese attacks. Wounded Marines rode in the truck beds, covered with tarps to protect them from the wind, but still exposed to minus 40-degree cold. Many wounded men froze to death during the movement, despite the best efforts of corpsmen to keep them alive. Some wounded Marines asked to be taken off the trucks and allowed to die rather than continue suffering, but the Marines refused. Everyone was going to Hagaru-ri. No one would be left behind. The column reached Hagaru-ri on December 4th after 3 days of continuous fighting. The Marines had suffered hundreds of additional casualties during the movement, but they'd accomplished what many thought impossible. They'd broken through Chinese encirclement and consolidated at Hagaru-ri with all their wounded and equipment. At Hagaru-ri, the airstrip was operating around the clock despite Chinese fire from surrounding hills. See, 47 transport aircraft were landing every few minutes, bringing in ammunition and supplies and evacuating wounded Marines. Between November 29th and December 6th, the Hagaru-ri airstrip would evacuate approximately 4,500 wounded Marines and soldiers, an extraordinary feat of logistics and bravery by pilots who landed under fire on a rough, short airstrip at minus 40 degrees. But there were too many wounded to evacuate by air. Thousands of wounded Marines would have to be moved by truck when the division continued its withdrawal south from Hagaru-ri to Koto-ri and then to the coast. The Marines loaded every available truck with wounded, stacking men in truck beds 3 and 4 deep, packing them as tightly as possible to share body heat and protect against the wind. The second phase of the breakout began on December 6 when the consolidated Marine force at Hagaru-ri, now more than 10,000 Marines plus several thousand Army troops, began moving south toward Koto-ri, 11 miles away. The Chinese were waiting. The road passed through a valley that the Chinese had turned into an elaborate ambush zone, with prepared fighting positions on the hills on both sides of the road and Chinese forces occupying every village along the route. The fighting was even more intense than the withdrawal from Yudam-ni. The Chinese were desperate to stop the Marines before they could escape the encirclement, and they threw everything they had at the withdrawing column. Human wave attacks, artillery fire, roadblocks, ambushes. The Marines fought through everything, suffering heavy casualties but never stopping, never giving up ground they gained, always moving south. The column reached Koto-ri on December 7th. The Marines had fought 11 miles in 2 days, killing hundreds of Chinese soldiers, suffering hundreds of their own casualties, but still intact as a fighting force. But the worst was still ahead. Between Koto-ri and the coast lay Funchilin Pass, a narrow mountain pass where the road crossed a deep gorge on a concrete bridge, and the Chinese had destroyed the bridge. The Funchilin Pass Bridge had been built by the Japanese during their occupation of Korea. It was a single-lane concrete bridge spanning a steep gorge with a 4,000-foot drop. The road on both sides of the bridge was carved into the mountainside, with sheer cliffs above and below. There was no alternate route. If the bridge was destroyed, vehicles couldn't cross the gorge, and the Marines would be trapped. On December 1st, Chinese engineers had blown up the bridge, dropping the central span into the gorge below and creating a gap of about 24 feet. When Marine engineers reached the site on December 7th and saw the destroyed bridge, many thought the division was finished. There was no way to repair a concrete bridge span in the middle of winter in minus 40-degree weather. The Marines would have to abandon their vehicles and equipment and try to escape on foot, leaving thousands of wounded behind. But Lieutenant Colonel John Partridge, the division's chief engineer, had a plan. The Marines could airdrop sections of a portable treadway bridge, a metal bridge designed to be assembled quickly for military use, and use them to span the gap where the concrete bridge had been destroyed. The problem was that treadway bridge sections were massive. Each section weighed about 2,500 pounds, and dropping them by parachute from aircraft in high winds over mountainous terrain was extremely risky. If the sections were damaged in the drop, or they fell into the gorge, the plan would fail. On December 7th, the Air Force attempted the drop. 8 treadway bridge sections were loaded onto C-119 flying boxcar cargo aircraft at an Air Force base in Japan. The aircraft flew to Funchilin Pass and attempted to drop the sections by parachute. The winds were strong, the terrain was treacherous, and the Chinese were shooting at the aircraft as they made their dropping runs. 6 of the 8 treadway sections landed near enough to the bridge site to be recovered. 2 sections fell into gorge or landed too far away to be retrieved. But 6 sections was enough, just barely, to span the 24-foot gap. Marine engineers worked through the night of December 8-9th in minus 40-degree cold, under Chinese fire from the surrounding hills, to assemble the treadway bridge sections and create a passable crossing. They had to level the approaches, position the metal sections precisely, secure them together, and reinforce the structure to support the weight of tanks and loaded trucks. It was extraordinarily difficult work in brutal conditions with Chinese soldiers shooting at them the entire time. By the morning of December 9th, the bridge was complete. Not pretty, not permanent, but functional. Tanks could cross. Trucks could cross. The Marines could continue their withdrawal. Over the next day, the entire 1st Marine Division crossed the improvised bridge at Funchilin Pass. Thousands of Marines, hundreds of vehicles, all the division's tanks and artillery, all the wounded riding in truck beds. The crossing was slow and dangerous. The bridge was narrow, only one vehicle wide. The drop on both sides was thousands of feet. Chinese forces were shooting at the crossing from the hills, and every vehicle that broke down or stalled on the bridge risked blocking the entire division. But the Marines got across. Vehicle by vehicle, unit by unit, wounded and equipment and all, the 1st Marine Division crossed the bridge at Funchilin Pass and continued moving south toward the coast. By December 11th, the Marines reached Hungnam, the port city on the coast where the Navy was assembling ships to evacuate X-Corps from North Korea. The fighting withdrawal was over. The 1st Marine Division had covered 78 miles in 14 days, fighting through Chinese forces that outnumbered them 4-1, in temperatures that reached minus 40 degrees and below, bringing out all their wounded and all their equipment. Behind them, the Chinese 9th Army Group was destroyed. The 9th Army Group had entered the battle with approximately 120,000 soldiers. By the end of the Chosin Reservoir campaign, Chinese casualties were estimated at 30,000 to 40,000 killed, and an additional 30,000 to 40,000 wounded or suffering from severe frostbite. The 9th Army Group would never again be combat effective. Entire Chinese divisions that had attacked the Marines were annihilated, not just defeated, but destroyed as functioning military units. The Marines had lost approximately 836 killed in action, 12,000 wounded or injured, including thousands of frostbite casualties, and several hundred missing or captured. By any measure, these were heavy casualties, about 40% of the division's strength, but the division was still intact, still organized, still capable of fighting. And more importantly, the Marines had achieved something that should have been impossible. They escaped from encirclement by a vastly superior enemy force. They brought out all their wounded and equipment, and they'd inflicted devastating casualties on the enemy in the process. Military historians would later analyze the Battle of Chosin Reservoir as one of the greatest fighting withdrawals in military history, comparable to the retreat from Moscow, Dunkirk, or the Long March. The Marines had been outnumbered, surrounded, fighting in the worst conditions imaginable, and they'd won. The evacuation at Hungnam continued through mid-December 1950. The Navy assembled every available ship, transport vessels, cargo ships, even merchant ships, to evacuate X-Corps from northeastern Korea. Over a period of about 2 weeks, the Navy evacuated approximately 105,000 soldiers, including the 1st Marine Division, 17,500 vehicles, 350,000 tons of supplies, and, in an unexpected humanitarian operation, approximately 98,000 North Korean refugees who wanted to escape advancing communist forces. The Hungnam evacuation was one of the largest seaboard evacuations in military history, exceeded only by Dunkirk in World War II. And unlike Dunkirk, where the British had to abandon nearly all their equipment, the X-Corps evacuation brought out everything: vehicles, artillery, supplies, even equipment that had been captured from the enemy. The 1st Marine Division was evacuated to Busan in South Korea, where they were reorganized, re-equipped, and brought back to combat strength. The division would continue fighting in Korea through 1951, participating in major battles and campaigns, before eventually being withdrawn from Korea in 1955. The Korean War itself continued until July 27, 1953, when an armistice was signed that ended active combat. The war didn't end with a peace treaty or a clear victory for either side. Korea remained divided at roughly the 38th parallel, with North Korea under communist control and South Korea as an independent democracy. American forces remained stationed in South Korea to deter North Korean aggression, a military presence that continues to this day, more than 70 years after the war began. The Battle of Chosin Reservoir had no direct strategic impact on the outcome of the Korean War. The Marines' successful withdrawal from Chosin didn't change the fact that UN forces had been pushed back from the Chinese border, that MacArthur's promise to end the war by Christmas 1950 had been shattered, and that the war would continue for another 2.5 years. From a strategic perspective, Chosin was a defeat. UN forces had been forced to retreat, abandoning North Korea to communist control. But from a tactical and psychological perspective, Chosin was a stunning victory. The Marines had been surrounded by overwhelming enemy forces in impossible conditions, and they'd fought their way out. They'd inflicted far more casualties than they'd suffered. They'd destroyed an entire Chinese army group. They'd proved that American forces could defeat Chinese human wave attacks. And they demonstrated a level of courage, determination, and tactical excellence that became legendary. Military academies around the world study the Battle of Chosin Reservoir as an example of how to conduct a fighting withdrawal under the most difficult conditions imaginable. The operation is analyzed for its tactical lessons. The importance of maintaining unit cohesion, even when surrounded. The value of close air support in providing firepower and evacuating casualties. The necessity of logistics planning and ensuring adequate cold weather equipment. The critical role of leadership at all levels, from division commanders down to squad leaders. The willingness to accept risk to achieve mission objectives. The absolute requirement to never abandon wounded comrades. But beyond the tactical lessons, Chosin became a defining moment for the United States Marine Corps. The phrase "frozen chosen" entered Marine Corps lore as shorthand for toughness, determination, and refusal to surrender under any circumstances. Chesty Puller's quote, "We're not retreating, we're attacking in a different direction," became a Marine Corps motto that encapsulated the attitude that had carried the Marines through the battle. Veterans of the Chosin Reservoir campaign formed an organization called the Chosen Few, a reference to the Shakespeare quote from Henry V. "We few, we happy few, we band of brothers," adapted to recognize that the survivors of Chosin were a select group who'd endured something extraordinary. The Chosen Few held annual reunions where veterans gathered to remember battle and honor the men who hadn't made it out alive. As the decades passed and the Chosen veterans aged, the reunions became smaller. Men who'd been in their 20s during the battle were in their 70s and 80s and 90s. They dealt with the long-term effects of their service. Chronic health problems from frostbite, PTSD from the intensity of the combat, survivors' guilt from having lived when so many comrades had died. Many Chosen veterans had lost fingers, toes, ears, or noses to frostbite during the battle. The frostbite damage was permanent, leaving visible scars that served as lifetime reminders of -40-degree combat. Some veterans had lost entire limbs to frostbite-induced gangrene that required amputation. Others suffered from circulation problems, nerve damage, and chronic pain from frostbite injuries sustained during those 17 days in November and December 1950. The psychological toll was just as significant as the physical injuries. Chosen veterans described nightmares about being cold, about being surrounded, about watching friends die. They described hypervigilance and difficulty sleeping. They described difficulty adjusting to civilian life after experiencing combat that intense. Many turned to alcohol to cope with the memories. Some suffered from depression. The diagnosis of PTSD didn't exist during the Korean War era. It wouldn't be formally recognized until after the Vietnam War, but Chosen veterans suffered from it nonetheless. But the veterans also expressed pride in what they'd accomplished. They'd survived something that should have killed them. They'd defeated an enemy that should have overwhelmed them. They'd brought out their wounded when it would have been easier to leave them. They'd lived up the Marine Corps motto, Semper Fidelis, always faithful, by refusing to abandon their comrades under any circumstances. Captain William Barber, who commanded Fox Company through 5 nights of Chinese attacks while wounded and unable to stand, received the Medal of Honor in 1952. He continued serving in the Marine Corps, eventually retiring as a colonel. He attended Chosen Few reunions regularly and spoke about the battle at military schools and public events. Barber died in 2002 at age 82, having lived more than 50 years after the battle that made him famous. Lieutenant Colonel Raymond Davis, who'd led his battalion through the mountains to relieve Fox Company, also received the Medal of Honor. He continued his Marine Corps career, eventually rising to the rank of general and serving as Assistant Commandant of the Marine Corps, the second highest position in the Marine Corps. Davis retired in 1972 after 33 years of service. He died in 2003 at age 88, remembered as one of the finest combat leaders in Marine Corps history. Lieutenant Colonel Louis Chesty Puller, the legendary Marine officer whose quotes inspired Marines at Chosin, continued his career and retired as a lieutenant general in 1955. He died in 1971 at age 73, the most decorated Marine in history with 5 Navy Crosses and numerous other decorations. His aggressive leadership style and colorful personality made him a symbol of Marine Corps fighting spirit, and his quotes from Chosin, particularly "We're not retreating, we're attacking in a different direction," are still taught to every Marine recruit. Major General Oliver P. Smith, who commanded the 1st Marine Division during Chosin, was promoted to lieutenant general after the battle. His cautious, methodical approach, criticized by some during the advance north but vindicated by the successful withdrawal, was recognized as having saved the division from destruction. Smith retired from the Marine Corps in 1955 and died in 1977 at age 84. Military historians credit his leadership as a critical factor in the Marine success at Chosin. The Chinese soldiers who fought at Chosin suffered even more than the Marines. Chinese casualties from combat in cold were staggering. Estimates range from 30,000 to 40,000 killed and an equal number wounded or seriously frostbitten. The Chinese Ninth Army Group was essentially destroyed as a fighting force and never recovered. Many Chinese soldiers who survived the battle suffered from permanent frostbite injuries, similar to what American Marines experienced. And unlike the American veterans, Chinese soldiers received little recognition or support after the war. The Chinese government classified records about the Korean War and didn't publicly acknowledge the extent of the casualties until decades later. The lessons of Chosin extended far beyond the Korean War. The battle demonstrated the critical importance of cold weather training and equipment for military forces. The U.S. military developed improved cold weather gear, better weapons lubrication for Arctic conditions, and specialized training for operating in extreme cold. Military planners studying potential conflicts in Northern Europe or Arctic regions drew on Chosin's lessons to prepare for cold weather operations. The battle also demonstrated the effectiveness of combined arms operations, the coordination of infantry, artillery, armor, and air support working together to achieve objectives. The Marines at Chosin used every asset available, from riflemen to tanks to aircraft, in a coordinated effort that multiplied their combat power and allowed them to defeat a numerically superior enemy. And perhaps most importantly, Chosin demonstrated the value of leadership and morale. The Marines were outnumbered and surrounded in the worst possible conditions, facing an enemy that should have destroyed them. What saved them wasn't superior technology or overwhelming firepower. The Chinese had numerical superiority, and the Americans were fighting with frozen weapons in minus 40-degree cold. What saved them was leadership at every level, from division command down to squad leaders, and the determination of individual Marines who refused to quit regardless of the odds. Today, the Chosin Reservoir is in North Korea, inaccessible to most Americans and rarely visited. The villages where Marines fought, Yudam-ni, Hagaru-ri, Hagaru-ri, are small settlements far from major population centers. The road where Marines conducted their fighting withdrawal is still there, still primitive, still passing through the same mountain passes where thousands of men died in 1950. But the memory of Chosin lives on. In Marine Corps lore and military histories, in the annual reunions of the Chosin few, though these reunions grow smaller each year as the last veterans pass away, and in the recognition that what happened there in November and December 1950 was something extraordinary, a triumph of human courage and determination over impossible odds. The Marines who fought at Chosin didn't think of themselves as heroes. They thought of themselves as Marines doing their jobs, following orders, taking care of their buddies, trying to survive. But what they accomplished was heroic by any definition. Surrounded, outnumbered, fighting in brutal cold that was killing them as surely as enemy bullets, they refused to surrender. They broke through Chinese encirclement, brought out all their wounded and equipment, and destroyed the enemy forces that tried to stop them. 78 miles, 17 days, minus 40 degrees, 30,000 Marines against 120,000 Chinese. Every tactical factor said the Marines should have been destroyed. Instead, they won. That's the legacy of the frozen Chosin, not a strategic victory. The war would continue for 2.5 more years and end in stalemate, but a tactical and moral victory that proved American forces could defeat overwhelming odds through courage, determination, and refusal to accept defeat. When military historians assess the greatest fighting withdrawals in history, Xenophon's March to the Sea, Napoleon's retreat from Moscow, Dunkirk, the Long March, the Battle of Chosin Reservoir stands alongside them. And when Marines talk about what it means to be a Marine, when they reference never leaving wounded behind and never giving up regardless of the odds, they're talking about values that were proved at Chosin. The last word should go to General Oliver P. Smith, who commanded the 1st Marine Division through the battle. Years later, when asked about Chosin, Smith said simply, "Retreat, hell, we're just attacking in a different direction. We're going to fight our way out of this. And we're bringing our dead, our wounded, and our equipment. The enemy is behind us, beside us, and in front of us. They won't escape this time." They didn't escape, and neither did the Marines. 78 miles through frozen hell, and every Marine who could walk made it out. That's the story of the frozen Chosin.